on the transitions from youth transitions from learning to earning. I'm sure in many regards you just require the introduction I should give, but you will know that he's worked for many years, probably more than he'd like me to say, as a researcher in the fields of education, training and skills, and it has written extensively, published on lifelong learning, apprenticeships, incentives to learn, employers' attitudes towards training and skills, and UK skills policy. He's currently director of the ESRC Centre based at Cardiff University on skills, knowledge and organisational performance. Amongst other things, he's done a consultancy and advisory, including to the parliamentary committees at Westminster and Holyrood, and is a member of the Scottish Funding Council's skills committees. His consultancy work includes working with the Treasury, the Cabinet Office, the Sector Skills Authority Agency, National Skills Task Force, and many others, including government organisations in Australia and New Zealand. I think you would agree, therefore, that we're very fortunate indeed to have Ewart here today to present his lecture to us. Bessie Yerke.
Well, can I begin by saying what an enormous pleasure it is to be with you today. Yes, I've been working in this scope for a longer time, 27 years as a full-time researcher, which is somewhat unusual in this day and age. Both could be in and end up getting a cover teaching job in university, and there seems to be researchers. I've managed to escape that baby for now, though things will change next year. What I'm going to try and do in this lecture presentation is to try and flesh out some of the ideas which my centre has been probing around the way in which the labour market operates and the incentives that it provides to people in education, students and prospective students, to engage in learning or not to engage in learning, and also in terms of which way those incentives will drive people in terms of their learning choice. I'm not going to have that much to say explicitly about information, advice, and guidance, but the underlying story that I'm going to tell is one that plainly has fairly major implications for information, advice, and the guidance, and where it should sit within the priority order of policymakers, probably rather a different place from where it currently sits with the priority order of at least English policymakers. This bill is not really one of the things that they ought to be worrying about terribly much. The other thing with a lecture is transitions. There's a great deal of literature that's come out in the last few years, basically since 2008, the recession, around youth transitions into the labour market. And what I'm going to be arguing is that the current crisis has made this issue visible, but it hasn't actually corrected it. The problem was there quite a while before. So, with no more ado, because I want to finish this lecture up preferably, definitely before 3 o'clock, you give you plenty of time to ask questions. Let's get on. Okay. As I say, transitions into the labour market have become a big source of concern. They're now much longer, they're generally more complex, and they're certainly much more risky than they were 30 years ago. You go back in time. Transitions were seen as being a relatively unproblematic activity for the vast bulk of lay people. It was only a small minority that you had to worry about. I suppose that belief really began to be eroded with the Great Recession of the early 1980s in the UK. But once that recession was over, when the 1990s, the noughties arrived, people seemed to be less worried about transition. But if you actually look at the time series data, what you see is that, as Simon, Schwartz and Ferguson say, today the journey from adolescence to adults are more daunting. It takes much longer, and the roadway is filled with far more potholes, one-way streets and dead ends. The world has become more complex. The labour market has become more complex. The choices within education become far more complex than they were 50 years ago. and choosing the right pathway to take has become a lot more important. I will argue that one of the reasons it's become more important is because of the way that the labour market changes have been tending to polarize opportunities and incentives. I guess the key thing to say that even if there have been no global recession, even if the banks had behaved responsibly, even if they'd actually understood what they were selling and we'd never had the crisis, youth transitions would still be problematic. Certainly in the South speaking. There's no doubt about it. But there's a much broader issue than just the recession. Structural shifts mean that the recession has made the effects of structural shifts more obvious, but the effects still exist. And the other point to bear in mind is that if that is the case, then even when we come out of recession, whenever that may be, it means that the problem will not be solved. Yes, the youth unemployment levels may very well drop, but the overall issue of how transitions are managed will remain one which will be much more complex than it was in the past. What are these changes? Well, I really want to mention these very briefly, because you can read about them at elsewhere. UK Commission for Employment Skills, through its youth inquiry work, CIPD, through Thomas recent work on the young unemployed, has stressed structural changes in the nature of the youth labour market. Those changes are, at least five of them, the ones I just said. The idea that employers are now increasingly looking for experience and that that's their key criteria when they're recruiting people. So young people get trapped in a no experience, therefore no job, therefore no experience cycle. And CIPD say breaking out of that is going to be really quite difficult unless and until employers change their preferences and start recognizing that it's really quite a silly thing to expect young people to have substantial amounts of experience from working in a workplace just like theirs before they will need to prick it. Casualised forms of employment are another major problem. Young people find it very hard to live with small hours, part-time contracts. They find 0 hours extremely difficult. It's not to say that those are particularly great deals for adult workers. The young people find it. And for recruitment methods, I sense done quite a bit of work looking at what we know about recruitment and selection in the UK. I think the key message would be this. But the HRM textbook model, and I went into your workshop just to see what the HRM textbooks were looking like, and I try not to look them too often. They haven't changed, the same old story. They have a lovely model of how recruitment and the selection should be undertaken. It's fine, but it's a minority sport. The bulk of employers do not apply that model of recruitment selections to their workforce. They use recruitment selection methods which tend to exclude the young, not least the use of word of mouth trickled. Huge problem against the OPD and UPCS. Back that up. Growth of small and medium-sized enterprises, many of them very small. The shifts in the proportion of people employed in micro businesses has been quite spectacular. If you look at UKCS publication Youth Employment Challenge, that explains the figures in detail. But those small businesses are precisely the ones who are likely to use informal recruitment, because they won't be using the textbook HRM model that was developed for IBM or Shell or BP or whoever in the 1980s. But overall, the size of the employer market has continued to shrink. CIP reckon that 60% of the respondents to their survey, so that's a slightly biased survey, it's a survey of members, but 60% said that their organisations had no recruitment channels for young people except at degree level. There was nothing below. So the only young people that actually have formalised recruitment channel for was graduates. Other than that, they were already. So those sorts of changes are plainly going to cause us some big problems. Now, the traditional way in which people are fronted up to this are particularly researchers in education departments, but also if you look at kind of research that's DFE and its predecessor, many government department bodies have used. Huge amounts of ideas that that if we could improve pedagogy, if we could just change the curriculum, if we could develop new qualifications and courses, we could inculcate employability, however we choose to define it as their being. We could drive up education and training achievement, completions, learners attainment, have some special schemes to disadvantaged groups, and we'd have more and better industry education collaboration, and I've been hearing that one for the last 30 years plus. We would somehow solve the problem of transitions. Now, I'm not going to say that I don't believe that there's a certain amount of truth in all of those things. I think there certainly is. But my presentation is going to ignore from here on in. They're really interesting, but they're not what I'm concerned with, because there are plenty of other people who are busy researching and looking at all of this in enormous detail. I want to look at the other side of the equation and try and explain why I think the other side of the equation matters and why it probably deserves more attention usually than else. Because in any process of transition, there's plenty of preparation for the transition, and then there's the state into which people are transiting. And an awful lot of traditional research has looked at the preparation stage, and relatively little of it has looked at what people are engaging towards the world of work. Less bit. More balanced approach. And I think that the state and structure of the labour market, employment opportunities theory, are really quite key to motivating young people to continue, participate, achieve in education and trade. And they're also quite important to trying to make transitions smooth. Not all transitions are ever going to be all that sweet. So in order to achieve better participation and achievement, which policy measures have had as a goal for 16 relating positive for the last quarter of a century, making transitions work better and maximising returns on public investments in education and training, given that money is now very scarce, that no point really matters. It's vital to find the bond side of the equation. And much of what I'm going to say from here on in is about levels of demand, structure of demand, quality as well as quantity of demand for labour, geographic and sectoral distribution of employment opportunities, and the incentives to learn they create. Now, I've been quite interested in incentives to learn, and in a minute I'll come. But just to reassure you that there is a structure to what I'm going to be saying, there is the structure. And talk a bit about jobs in the bottom of the labour market, problems they create, limited employer demand per skill, that's a reality, problems with low-end vocational qualifications, see Bessel, complexity, risk and disengagement, overqualification and underemployment, some suggested solutions, which I'm afraid is a rather short section, and implications and final thoughts. Okay. Right, incentives to learn. Now, I've wasted quite a lot of the last 2 or 3 years trying to create what I believe to be a creative framework, thinking about the incentives to learn. There's a huge body of literature which I spent, I reckon, 6 months just reading through on the different ways in different academic disciplines, primarily educationists and economists, have thought about the incentives to learn. And they all do it from their own very narrow particular take on the issue. What I've tried to do, I'm not sure it's successful, but worth a go, is to try and create a more unified framework for evaluating the strength, pattern, duration of different incentives and try and map. And what I'm arguing is you can really break it down to 2 simple types. Type 1, incentives are those inside the learning process, or in a minute tell you what they are. And they're the ones that people in education departments tend to be very, very keen on. So 2 incentives are generated in wider society, and when they're generated in the labour market, economists are receiving them. If they're generated with the wider culture, parental culture, ethnic culture, community culture, whatever it may be, sociologists are quite interested in those. And I suppose the argument that I'm going to make is that if type 2 incentives are weak and complex or uncertain, those may not participate and succeed, and that endlessly trying to justify one incentive on its own may not work if the type 2 incentives are not strong enough. Okay, so examples of type 1. So we're very clear what I think they are. They're the usual things that, anyone in the Department of Education will know about. Curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, assessment encourages participation rather than rationally. Institutional cultures in schools, you've got to just nurture potential, celebrate achievement, and so on. We all know that all of that is very important. That's what tends to be very visible. But type 2 incentives are often much longer lasting because they last throughout the rest of your life once you leave the education system, and they last insofar as they're present. Policymakers have been very key on the first point. They love to look at wage returns to particular qualifications. Unfortunately, it tends to look at average returns, which are DQ leading. There's a lot of variation around the average. Other benefits which come to push people to learn: the intrinsic interest, job, the opportunities for progression, travel. Social status from higher level motivations pushes a lot of people to learn. License to practice and mandatory CPD regulations plainly makes lifelong learning an obligation, not just an option. So for those jobs that have it, it produces very strong faculty incentives that last through your working life. Cultural expectations in society, equal class segments therein, non-economic benefits to doing the hard satisfaction. And last point, in a sense, is the lifelong learning point, which policymakers in the UK have basically incised to the conceptual prospect. All very nice, all very lovely, but they're not really very interested in that area. I need just the economic gains. I decided that ultimately they are narrow utilitarians, because that probably a very unfortunate choice on their part, but that's another question. Okay, so having set out my stall in terms of what I think the incentive structure is, will you find? What's the problem with what I and some colleagues in my centre, and actually with some other colleagues in the sociology and personnel management, find as bad jobs? Well, bad jobs can be defined as the slight suggests. Low pay, less than 2/3 the median wage. About 20% of the working population and given minors in the UK are earning less than 2/3 the median wage. Insecure and casualised work, lack of control over your own job in terms of how you pace the work, in terms of how you do the job, high level of stress, which is often associated with ongoing work intensification. Shrek, though it's more. Yeah, a little nervous shit of theirs, they think, yeah, that's me. Unfortunately, we tend to avoid the dull, boring, repetitive, short job cycle time element of a lot of bad jobs. Job cycle time, 30 seconds. Day in, day out, so you go mad. Like opportunities in progression. I'll come back to 6 because that actually really matters. A lot of people get trapped in these jobs. No, you won't say, well, okay, it's bad news if you're in one, but what's this got to do with incentives? Well, it's got to do with incentives for a variety of reasons, but the lack of progression was quite important. We know from research that my centre speaker that job opportunities to progress are often not very good in a lot of these low-end jobs. We've been a key curiosity the cafe sector, very under-researched sector. It's actually a growing area in flow. What we found is that yes, some workers will end up to be supervised, so they will move up to be manager, Starbucks or a Costa or whatever. But there are small steps for low rewards. Very often the manager earns 50p an hour more than the workers they're managing. And actually they spend up to 90% of their time doing exactly the same job as the people they're managing, like making and serving coffee. They just do the management in the sort of washing up time. And the really interesting issue, which we know not just through our own research, but through huge quantitative studies like Sherman Mackay's work or DWP in 2011, that qualifications play a very different role in the fast falter progression by low infirmities. Whatever helps them to progress, elate the fact that they acquired a qualification. So that's just a bit worrying. Really quite great. The other important point is that low-end jobs are not fading away. In the early noughties, the story was that it's going to be a knowledge-based economy. Low-end jobs just get gradually dwindle away as we all became more skilled. Everything would be very, very sunny. Well, didn't turn out that way, and I have to say some of us who are fairly cynical in nature, like myself, never really thought would expect pan out that way. But we know very clearly that the number of low-paid jobs in the UK as a portion of the overall workforce will not start to drop this side of 2020. They're probably actually increasing at the moment. And interestingly, there's a very interesting paper by the New Economics Foundation, which shows that the range of jobs available for non-graduates is shrinking, surprise, surprise. And most of the job growth for non-graduates is likely to be in the lowest paying sectors of the economy. Upskilling these workers will not have much effect. It's not going to solve their problems in terms of finding jobs that are likely to access. Let's take one example for a real sector, and let's call it let's go for mass retailing, because retailing is such a big part of our economy. The largest single occupational group in the UK is retail assistants, and that's actually not counting checkout operators. They're a separate occupational subcategory. You put them in, they're the shop assistant. You know, generically say that shop assistants. There because even bigger. There are more people employed in retailing than there are in manufacturing. It's also, as certainly was when it was doing well, the dominant model for many other bits of the service set. So you would find managers running fitness centres who would say, oh yeah, we really want to be like Tesco's. Agencies would say this, we really want to be like Tesco's. Trailers find really frightened. So I really don't like Tesco's that much as a shop. And the idea of a model for how anyone would run their bank seems to be awkward. But fitness centres are saying, it's all about customer care. We don't want our fitness instructors to have huge levels of skill, unlike, say, a French, the management of French fitness centres. No, we just want them to be good at this generic thing, the customer service. And everyone said, we want to be like the big, successful retailers. I know book, but it's really scary. It may not be true now. It was true when I wrote the book, but it may not be true for much longer. But Morrison's was, possibly still is, the largest provider of something labelled apprenticeships. They would be recognised as apprenticeships elsewhere in Europe, but no matter. Fast bulk is able to offer the service for existing employees. But that tells you something about the importance. Or if you actually look at the number of retail sector, so-called apprenticeships, huge apprenticeship success. Well, it's a sexual labour market, and when I say dysfunctional, it's probably not dysfunctional from the employer's point of view, but it may be dysfunctional from the point of view of individuals and wider society. Internal labour markets in most big retailers are pretty beauty. There are a few upward runs, and the vast bulk of people are not going to access them. Some will, but not many. Moreover, those who are trying to farming are now increasingly meeting graduates, cascading down the structure. 29% of all recent graduates working in magnet to so retail. So the jobs that you could have aspired to 20 years ago if you started on the shop door going to be a damn sight harder to get hold of, because there's a graduate who's now going to be parachuted to spearhead a particular section. Much of this low retail work is relatively de-skilled, and the specifications for the vocational qualifications reflect this reality. It's interesting that the Morrison's trainees, apprentices, are not studying a retailing NDQ. They're studying a customer service NDQ. Go and have a look. I downloaded the City and Guilds Level 2 MBQ in customer service. Runs through the specification, runs just over 220 pages. I don't think there's a single skill in that described in that qualification that you wouldn't expect a reasonably competent person to have acquired simply by doing the job for 9 months. It's a really problematic model of an occupational skill profiles, and the qualifications then reflect that problematic. And we also learn that skill utilization is often extremely poor. There are a lot of retail workers are wildly overqualified. The jobs they're doing, particularly married returners who landed up sitting on Waitrose checkout. They've probably got A-levels, lots of degrees, possibly not the best use of their skills. A couple of lovely little quotes from Johnson's study of young male retail workers are receiving training. It's not absolutely clear whether the trade they're receiving is trained to gain or apprenticeship, but the fact makes pretty a difference. These are people who've been doing the job for a while and now being trained largely at your and my expense as taxpayers, and that's their clothes. This will come in once a week and review us through the customers up the and well, hey, we've got a certificate. Employers are not sitting there saying, I hope someone will end my queuing retailing comes along because we could redo something like that. They wasn't actually giving us any training. It was a total waste of time. It's like, if the government really wants everyone to have a qualification by their day, yeah, sure, it'll work, but it's not going to achieve anything. It's interesting that the kids going through this process have probably got the more realistic view of its value than many of the policymakers who designed these policies. And that, I want to tell you something. Those two respondents are not stupid. They were actually sussed out what's happening, thinking, well, very well, sorry, what's the added value? And this pushes the punchline. For those who think, although they're heading towards such jobs, they create weak incentives, gooey issue. No one answer fiddling around pedagogy curriculum or assessment in and of itself will compensate for the weak, patchy, uncertain type 2 incentives coming from that particular labour market. Many people do not like to hear that message. They believe that there is some magic combination, curriculum, pedagogy and assessment, that can somehow override labour market incentives. And I am afraid, I think now for 30 years of experimentation, we need to accept that's probably not the case. It's not to say that you can't make type 1 incentives stronger and then that's not important. But on its own, it probably isn't enough. Because if in any given labour market, the number of jobs is finite at any given moment and is exceeded by the supply of those seeking work, and the number of good and desirable jobs is a finite subset of the jobs available, then the following conclusions are likely to be correct. There will be losers. Some people will get jobs, but they won't get good jobs, and some people will get no jobs at all. There's a job queue, and education and training can move in the ends up and down that job queue, but in and of itself, it doesn't create more or better jobs. It just repositions who gets those jobs. Raising educational attainment will not give everyone a job on its own. If everyone tomorrow was magically given not just a degree in a little piece of paper, but the actual learning that went with it, that still wouldn't there wouldn't be 20% of the jobs in the UK market or low pay. Any of those jobs would carry on being low pay, and it would just mean that they become by graduates. I'll come back to they might have to be done by graduates because I've got a skin statistic for you on that one. So, a higher the level of unemployment, a higher levels of inequality in terms of job quality across the available OPs, the larger the pool of bad or poor jobs relative to good ones, particularly within specific local labour markets, and the weaker the returns to qualifications, the more likely it is that at least some people thinking about investing in learning will think to themselves, well, I'm faced with prospects of getting an awesome job, and the incentives I have to learn are pretty complex, are pretty patchy, are pretty uncertain, and they're therefore risky. And I'm going to come back to the issue of risk. But in the face of those 4 points, which look to me pretty much like the English labour market at the moment, particularly in certain areas of the country, young people, and actually adults as well, will tend to respond rationally. We also know that many of the opportunities that young people tend to access are in areas of the economy where low quality employment across the range of dimensions I already suggested are quite large. A lot of young people go to hospitality and retail. Both those sectors have structural features in their employment market which are probably not providing terribly good quality employment a lot of the time. And in positional competition for a finite supply of good jobs, quite a lot of people know that certain types of students will tend to get certain types of work, given their social class background and the kinds of institutions they've been to. So for those students who are not those higher students, what are the impact on their incentives to learn? Because in a sense, it's not a level playing field. And an awful lot of young people know that on by here. People do perceive behavior. An aspiration may reflect into a reality of how good and bad jobs are currently allocated. The Gracie and Kelly quote, and the Gracie and Kelly article is a really useful article, which I referenced in my I5 scout paper on transition. I think it's quite important. Well, we always assume that when young people do something, well, policymakers do assume, when young people do something that policymakers don't like, young people are acting irrational and just being silly. Or just irresponsible, or not bothering for big. No, actually, I think the opposite is true. I think they're certainly acting rationally within a bounded way. Quite often, they're acting rationally in a more total vision of rationality. They're actually react quite sensibly to the structure of incentives that they face. So, if you want to change their behavior, change the structure, which is difficult. Again, Ingrid Schoon's point makes the same point in a different way. There's also some very interesting research by a couple of researchers, Sinclair and someone else, looking at young people's aspirations. They show very clearly that I think it's key stage 3, young people's aspirations are far higher than the job opportunities that are available on the market, and then fairly rapidly they become more realistic. Their aspirations are then recalibrated downwards to actually match what the labour market has to offer. And I think Archer's point is that if we want to change our ambition, we need to stop the idea that we're changing individual minds. We need to worry about collective circumstances and need to worry, therefore, about what the European Union talks about, more and better jobs. But of course, that's a big ask on policymakers. Even when the economy is doing well, it's a big ask. Okay, how to employer demand, because in a sense that's the next ghastly truth. Employer demand for skills is really probably weaker than we think. The quote from Francis Green was a iCeGS praxis paper. A job policy is a really important one. If we want to explain why we don't do very well in the OECD papers on basketball participation, don't look at speed, don't look at qualifications, don't look at pedagogy, just look at back home. That the labour market is actually not providing the demand pull that would actually make young people sit there and think, yeah, I really need to get HADAS qualifications, I really need to do a bit of post-compulsory schooling, because if I don't, the labour market appeals. We actually send weaker messages, and that's a huge, huge problem. The other fact on that slide, which I regard as is one of the few facts in recent years that has genuinely astonished. I'm hard to astonish after 27 years full-time research. According to Jeff Mason, believes this, Lake said, I've no reason to doubt Jeff. It's labour force survey data, and it's being replicated by other survey analysis. Workforce training across the UK, workforce in terms of what proportion of workforce got some training, peaked in 80,000 and has been in decline ever since. They are back to where we were in 1993. That, despite all of the subsidy, all of the exhaustion, all of the fighting, it actually has had not only no positive effect, but less than any effect. You actually need to slide in there and you backwards. Notice the slide started long before the recession. That's a demonstrated fact that suggests that our training policies for the last 20 years have had pretty close to no real impact on how employers are choosing to invest in their workforce. This also is a startling feel. I actually went and read the government consultation on the apprenticeship standards in England. It's probably not a document many people have ever waded through. It's pretty dull. But hidden amidst the dullness, as is so often the case, are some startling facts. There are 357 responses, not all of them I hasten to add, but there's quite a lot from both training providers. And that was what came out of it. 70% of respondents rejected the idea that maths and English should be required in all graduates for apprenticeship. Dali. We can manage without asking. 68% didn't want ICT qualification or pros. We don't do that kind of stuff. But only 53% agreed that all 6 of the personal learning and thinking skills we need all pros. Well, that's 27%, but they weren't needed. How sophisticated can you make your framework was plainly the question that was running through the minds of the respondent. Only 35% thought that a ludicrous generous 250 hours of the job learning was needed. They wanted far less, and they actually got it. Guthrie scaled the job learning down to 100 hours in response to a lack of enthusiasm. Now, if you show those figures to people from most North European countries, they just go into shock. Because the idea that that kind of attitude, well, compared to working apprentices, is completely astonishing to them. They just cannot believe it. The idea that you wouldn't want your young trainees in an apprenticeship to learn maths in their native language is astonishing. They wouldn't need to do some ICT learning. They wouldn't need some personal learning thinking skill. Most overseas, where most European apprenticeships, they'd also be doing a hard science subject. It's probably physics. They'd certainly be doing, many of them doing foreign language, and probably be doing some history and some other general education, all that. What we've said instead is, how small can we make the optional element? How small can we make the educational element in this program? How can we maximize the use of the government subsidy government's giving us while minimizing the return on that public investment? Not a good message. Does suggest some structural problems with demand for skills. That's also a gem-like point. And not that one. Too much aspiration is actually a bad thing. I suspect some of the people in this room are guilty of encouraging too much aspiration. There is a mismatch between employer requirements and learner aspirations. We still have a large number of jobs which are at level 2 or below. The drive for more and more advanced apprenticeships is creating the expectation among skilled degree currents who then become unwilling to consider lower levels. And why, you see? And actually, to be fair to the luckless Shropshire training provider, they were only telling the truth. In a sense, don't shoot the messenger. They're not they're not the direct cause of the problem. The direct cause of the problem is employers have lots of jobs at level 2, but this all dates back in constructed incentives the labour market provides to your people. It dates back into the development design of EQs, where a lot of employer inputs, particularly from the SMBs, employers need to put some brake on the breadth, depth and transferability as specified. The potential for skill supply to exceed demand and create overqualification and underutilization. Okay, so following on from that last slide, points. Problems with low-level BQs. The Wolf Review told policymakers suddenly that I think a fair number of this is known for quite a while, which is that there are a lot of low-level BQs, which, while they further a participation agenda, may not actually do very much more. They give people something to do. It's not entirely clear that it leads anywhere that's particularly useful. They're just doing something. And the participation argument is something that people like Louis Steedman have recently criticised, I think rightly, as problematic policy skill. Participation in what matters. Competence-based qualifications are often pretty narrow, they're very task-specific, little or low general education, offer no foundation for citizenship like on learning or return to academic learning, and how very often have a limited hold on recruitment and selection. And they are very different, as anyone who's read the Brockman, Clark and Winch book on vocational qualifications in Europe will know. They are very different from what most of our European competitors are behind people. They get a much broader diet of general education within the vocational stream. Wolf concluded quite correctly that many VQs which may or may not be suitable for adults. I think there's an interesting argument to be had on that one.
whether they are or not suitable for adults, they're extremely unsuitable for young people, particularly when the course has become the VQ. But the course of study is basically you do this VQ, you pass it, I collect my money, and you move on. That's a big problematic model, but it's the one the Funding Council and many others pursued for a very long time. However, Wolf sets everyone a big challenge, which is the one that policymakers seem to be very keen on, which is around qualification design. How can we redesign qualifications? Well, in order to show better wage returns and hold on the labour market.
Really interesting question. In areas like cleaning, retailing, hospitality, what level 2 VQ could you design that would actually show substantial wage picking? No, but possibly not very easy to do.
Another point is that for a lot of level VQs, they set up a very complex incentive structure, dependent, as we know from research, on age, gender, type and level of qualification, subject and occupation it's related to, location in which the load takes place. Though interestingly, recent research findings have suggested that the workplace premium has vanished. VQs, we don't know why. And who pays for it? The employer pays for it. Very often it actually appears to have more value, partly because the employer wouldn't pay for it unless they thought they could use it and then reward people for having it. But that's a complex pattern of incentives. So low-level BQs are a bit risky. The returns to them are variable, complex, sometimes core. The returns to level 2A BQs in particular are very low and very uncertain. And all of the talk that is in policy documents about averages is completely misleading. There is a huge variation around the average. The average tells you very, very little. So complexity and uncertainty equals risk. Those at the lower ends of the ability range or labour market often face the weakest and most uncertain type 2 labour market incentives. They're also studying for the qualifications that show the weakest and most uncertain returns. And for those who can't aspire to enter higher education, the choices weighted poor and non-participation, and the semi-rational, probably actually fully rational in some cases. I already made this point, but it's worth repeating. Participation on its own is a very strange policy goal. Most European countries do not regard participation in and of itself as a sufficient policy goal here for what they want young people to be doing. The whole idea is the really interesting little article, centerpiece, based on saying the academy NEET is a really problematic one, in part because the idea, as long as you're participating in something, even if what you're participating in is valueless, you're not NEET. So the idea that NEET is somehow, if your NEET is dark and black and if you're not NEET, it's much lighter and better, possibly not. We also know that many people give up. Many people don't participate because they think they've got a strong chance of not achieving. Many people drop out because of jobs. They may be acting rational, given what they know about how local labour law actually functions.
We also know from a lot of research that's being done on private patient provision that those who have few resources tend to be very, very risk averse because they can't afford to lose the scarce few resources they have. Those who have lots of resources can afford to take risks. So children from better off backgrounds can succeed because they can fail. They can actually do things that kids from poorer backgrounds don't dare to try because it's risky, and if they fail, the consequences of failing are significant for them and their parents. Now it comes to the problem of oversupply. Oversupply is currently feels very much in terms by us to make business of volume. Too many young people chosen too few jobs. You find it. Actually, a much bigger long-term problem may be underemployment and overqualified workforce chasing jobs that often one could skip. Why does that matter? Well, because labour market power equals relative scarcity. That's basic labour market economics 101. But policymakers endlessly miss. One of the things that I really enjoyed in Alison Wolf's review were backbone. Other things they would call high wage returns to a particular form of qualification, mean high demand for
or short supply of the skills and qualities to which it attaches. That's a real start problem, because we know that the medium qualifications probably that is not likely to be the case. But scarcity equals power, bargaining power, wage power. So if there isn't relative scarcity, don't expect high tenants. Unfortunately, we created a situation where not only is there not scarcity, there's actually hardly superfluity of skills. Gradually, the skills survey in individuals, people who've got qualifications they believe are higher than needs to get the job and to do the job. Yeah, but that's the truth there. Skills survey, now called the Workplace Skills Survey, has been out in the field this year. The results are expected next April. I think if I were joining the dotted line, we'd be, how much will be out of 39%? How much will be out of 4%? 45%? Who knows? But let's put it this way, I'm not expecting the train to reverse. I was in the UKCS Youth Inquiry showed 23% of 24 to 29-year-olds are in, or got degrees, are in, 26% are in occupations that require it. We've also got mismatched intermediate level, which is smaller, but still by OECD standards large. We have major problems about underemployment. We also have major problems that many, or at least a proportion of these people get stuck. This isn't some transitory phenomenon that they move out of. Quite a lot of them seem to be getting stuck for longer and longer periods of time in jobs where they're overqualified. Really scary statistic. This really not bad when I saw it. UKCSE Joseph Browntree had a little inspiration of what would happen if we had or were going to hit the leach targets. If we hit the leach targets in 2020, how much would that produce port? Well, the answer was not a lot. The estimates varied, but it was pretty significant, statistically insignificant amount. But what they did found, using the Institute of Employment Studies, Institute of Employment Research, working groups model, that if nothing changes on the way the current education traces the supplying more skilled labour, by 2020, across the lowest 3 deciles of earning, in other words, the lowest earning 30% of our workforce, at least 30% of those workers will have a QF level sports rate. In other words, they'll have some degree or above qualifications. And in fact, for the lowest decile, which will be people who are in work poverty or risk without a doubt, 33% that will have some degree or above qualification. Now, that is not good news, and were I running this student loan company, I'd be thinking about what my next job was. Overqualification reduces trading down, which we all know about. Other projects are actually displacing other sorts of workers there. But we've had a very problematic policy combination. More, the government war, weak inflation by some dikes, it's fair to say, increasing positional competition with limited supply of good or livingly good jobs. UKCS's estimate, the OECD's estimate, that greatly highly followed by how person power is outspeaking the increase in the supply of jobs immediately divided by a factor 6 times, and then on top of that you could put it a 5th point, which is the section. Big problem. Outcome? That's the outcome. Trading down to ensure getting a job, widening dispersion in graduate earnings, trading down the space as other young people, scarring impact on lifetime earnings may be significant. The graduates get trapped by e-skills. Science good at applications, the prospective students getting message pretty quickly and starting to look harder at the value of that degree. A chilling effect by aspirations caused by ABPHE, increasing uncertainty about the investing time, energy, money in all forms of post-compulsory education. Trade. Don't want to, with an audience like you, I don't have to go because you already know about this. But I think it was very helpful at us, because again, it's not the model of how people make choices in the minds of policymakers, politicians, and civil servants. They don't see it like that because their careers don't look like that. They've actually been simple and linear. Private school, Oxford, couple of years in the think tank, career politician, or so on. Seriously, look at their CVs. Okay, implications. But what are the implications for us? Well, one is that broader rather than narrow courses, particularly for vocational learners, might make some sense. But of course, it's not the direction we've been heading in for the last 30 years. Good, and you'll be pleased to see good information about iCeGS is helpful, but good information about iCeGS requires clear understanding of the complex patterns of risk and reward. It's not just about job openings out there, it's what they lead to, what they pay. And actually getting your head around that, I could prove quite difficult. And although the data's there, it's not presented in terribly user-friendly format because basically policymakers are not necessarily all that keen that too many other people know about some of these values, because if they did, the current basis relative policy could start to implode. Participation in and of itself in post-compulsory education is a pretty feeble goal. Participation in what is the question you need to ask. In what, leading to what? Because if the answer is participation in something that's pretty crappy, that doesn't lead anywhere, then given how scarce people's resources are, there is a serious question whether that kind of participation makes a lot of sense. Could we read it back? I ask myself. Okay, we're now on to the solutions. Well, one solution that obviously government, and by government I mean any part of the government that they did entirely over the last 20 years, has got incredibly, wildly, and I would have to say over-enthusiastic about its being apprenticeship. We need to be clear where we stand. And there's an interesting contrast in between Scotland. Scotland's been much more successful at making apprenticeship work in the way it's meant to. Not perfect, but not better. Far more of their apprenticeship places are for young people, not existing adult employees. They have a higher proportion of employers engaged in apprenticeship, and far more of their apprenticeships are at level 3 level 2. Now, the Scottish labour market and economy is not that different from the English. So if they can do it, they set their minds to it, why can we not? Because at the moment, a lot of what we label apprenticeship in England would be laughed at by European employers. They would just look at it and say, oh, sorry, this isn't apprenticeship, this is adult in trade. This is accreditation of prior learning for adult workers. Or if it is for young people, it's at such a low level and with such a narrow diet of vocational learning that we would not count this as an apprenticeship. And I'm afraid that is the simple fact. The other crucial fact is that trainee demand exceeds employer supply. There are far more young people who wish to be apprentices than there are apprenticeship places, particularly in good firms. The proportion of young people applying to become BT apprentices, which is now open also to adult workers who genuinely want to retrade what you'd say. I think we have something like 100 applicants per place. It's much harder to get a BT apprenticeship than it is to get a place in Oxford College. So if you want to make apprenticeship work, the crucial issue is not young people's aspiration, it's employee commitment. And unfortunately, it seems to be that one of the problems when she faces it is great-great-grandson or great-great-granddaughter of YTS. And actually, you can go back to two-year YTS had a much more demanding off-the-job element, 13 whole weeks off of the job, but 100 hours, doesn't it? This has a presentation, which would suggest that we've, as usual, looked at this in the last 25 years. The other solution I flag up very briskly, I don't really have time to go into it in any great detail here, but I think in the background paper which I'm providing with these PowerPoints, the reference is there. It's a report by Hamilton for the OECD. The hypertext link is in the paper. Really interesting, but in the United States of America at state level,
the idea of broad vocational pathways, fewer in number, 6 in some states, up to 13 in others, but that takes out the whole spectrum of employment opportunities, encompasses both vocational and the educational pathway into those occupations, also linked quite often to economic development. Cluster policy seems to be a notion which is being picked up. It's being picked up in Australia to some extent, it's being picked up in New Zealand quite strongly. The OECD is now beginning to get on this bandwagon. It's really interesting that in terms of pathways, the pathways are not just pathways through education to a point of transition of the educations, it's the work of the employment system. They are then pathways that carry on inside the labour market in terms of being able to move up the occupational ladder. That really seems to be one of the key things. That instead of seeing young people as being training for an entry-level job, which then, after that, one year old, is actually about seeing it as a ladder that extends, up through the education and training system, and then up through the labour market, the employment system, the occupation and sector. I think it's an interesting model. But again, the kind of BQs that we currently have are precisely the kind of BQs we don't need to make this kind of work. I suppose the other area where we really, really, really do the thing are, in terms of finding solutions, is by issuing challenge towards. And I take my hat off to the UK Commission for Employment Skills to throwing down the gauntlet to its events, through its youth inquiry. I think that by basically saying that whatever problems we have with young people and their ability to integrate into the local market, the bulk of the responsibility for tackling those problems now must come to lie with employers through things like offering good, high-quality work placements, work experience scheme is a really important one. Whether that challenge will be taken up by government, whether it will be replayed to employers by government, and whether the vast bulk of employers will do anything other than sit on their hands and stare at the ceiling while challenges being issued, it's another matter entirely. My suspicion is that we do have a huge problem in that we spent the last 30 years telling employers that they are customers of the education and training system rather than participants in it. And therefore they tend to be rather grumpy customers who answer to every problem is to say, well, if only you lousy school teachers, if only you lazy colleges, if only you lazy universities would provide better caliber of student, more employable at the end, that we would be able to do even less training than we currently. Problematic. I really do think that there are obviously employers who don't that model, but there are enough who do for it to be a major part but difficulties we face. Okay, my final thoughts. I think is really worth, and I would say is having invented this model are type 1 and type 2 incentives, because I suspect that when you actually look hard at the type 2 incentives that a lot of young people face, they're pretty feeble, they're pretty risky, they're pretty uncertain, and young people are going to interpret them in ways that take heed towards choices that are rational but not problematic. We really need to try and reduce over time the number of for-pause jobs, because they, particularly where they're the jobs that young people are likely to believe themselves to be heading for, they make things more difficult, they make learning less likely to be incentivized, and they make the transitions much more conditional and uncertain. The design of qualifications in courses for initial vocational, actually I'd say in training, but you could say education since the diplomas have now gone or going. We know what we used to think before we used to go over what the academic route was there for, and we used to think it was doing okay. I don't know, all the cards are in the air now, but I'll leave people on the roll route. Yeah. But people not on the A-level route, in post-compulsory education, you really need to go back to basics and look at both the courses and the qualifications and say, are these fit for purpose when we look at what other countries are doing? Solutions won't be easy to find, but unless we start to tackle some of these problems, then those problems will remain with us for a very long time to come. there are things that can be done. Higher education and training providers to improve the employability and work readiness of young people, but they often require the costlier input from employers. I would argue that if I was Secretary of State or whatever, doesn't ever happen, thank goodness,
Being together apprenticeships, work experience, qualification design, recruitment selection and employment practices, rethinking occupational wage and career structures and their skill requirements, and then market regulation would probably be needed to actually tackle the Type 2 incentives problems. Now, you couldn't do it overnight. You have to do it in baby steps, given where we're starting from. But that would be my suggestion. Sir. Everyone's meanwhile unemployed, underemployed, credentials, ugly transitions, and wasted both public and private investment. We also require, and this is the message by Centre has been producing for the last 40 years of its life, we need product market, innovation, and competitive strategies within more businesses that drive rising demand for skills. Until demand for skills rises substantially within our labour market and economy, the problems I have described cannot solve. Consequently, on the first bullet point is the second, systems of work organisation, job design, and employee relations that stress good skills utilization, work-based skill formation, and workplace innovation are also present. Those are both a big ask. Now, I suppose that the overall message, that one of the messages that might come from what I said, is that the world of the labour market is really quite complex. It doesn't mesh well with the policy direction. And of one of them, sort of in a sense, ticking time bombs or ticking passes that you could argue I'm handing to you as the information advice guidance community, is that you have a role in transmitting some quite problematic news to a lot. Thank you very much.
Well, that's I tell you what, I was asked to share the discussion session. I need to watch with my watches stop. Or a portion of inward sharing a final session. You've pressed this. I mean, I'm sure you've been extremely realistic. I mean, what you have described is we're in this low skills equilibrium and stuck with self-reinforcing and so on. I just think that there's an area of debate in terms of questions and discussion about whether we challenge that and how we challenge that. I mean, the challenge has been that's not that way. We're left with poor economic growth, can't compete and so forth. We've got to do something about it. The bit that you were suggesting, I think, was that doing it totally from the supply side without involving employers as an active participant. You think that Balancing coming in as part of the supply side is not going to work. I mean, you've also said it's a lot of SMEs. How on earth do you activate SMEs to path forward? So there's a debate around all of that, is we might want to challenge. And then there's the implications for what you've got IAG, Career Information Advice and Guidance. Because you said how important it is. I can see how it is from the point of view of individuals. Very important point of view of individuals. Because if they get stuck with this, I mean, the notion was you've got to find out where it's going to work and where things will work for you and how to avoid the potholes and all the cul-de-sacs and all of that. But is government going to invest in IG, and why should they, frankly? Because all you're doing, you said, but it was kind of a zero-sum game, and you might encourage some people to aspire, but in a zero-sum game, then some are going to go down. And then there's the issue about the links to social mobility, because you'll say it's incredibly self-reinforcing. If you want to do something about that, there is an argument for IG there. But then it's got to confront some of those realities. So, I mean, it seems to me that's the second area we might want to kind of explore. But I don't know if they want to. I'd quite like to say a little bit more about the IG thing before we open it up, because you said how important it is, but it seemed to me you were saying how important it is for individuals. See, the Leach argument was it matters in terms of policy, because we need a skills revolution, and that requires investment from employers. The state and individuals have got to make this happen, and therefore we should invest in career service, which has now become the National Career Service, and the rationale is precisely that, to encourage individuals to raise their skills. Now, that was the argument, and my assumption is you don't buy it.
No,
I hope you do.
I do, but I think that I would think of it in terms of labour market information. But in a sense, and though, I mean, obviously the two are bound up, I always think it'd be, I suppose, perhaps wrongly, information advice and guidance is largely being focused on individuals, or perhaps on groups of students, or learners, or potential learners. Labour market information is playing vital to that role, but it's also vital to employers to get them to try and do their workforce planning in order to forecast their future skill requirements and to try and get them to up their game and spot the gaps. So LMI is absolutely crucial. What's really interesting is that there's now a senior civil servant in BIS who used to be in DWP. When I made exactly that point, said, no, we don't need LMI. We just need good careers advice about the kind of jobs that people could do, and then they will sort it out for themselves. And we certainly don't want to waste money collecting lots of LMI. Now, fortunately, he has been overruled for the moment. But it's a very straight sort of textbook model that all you have is the individual, give them some information, and then they will go away and make their decision. In a sense, the way that many policymakers confront information advice and guidance is purely labour market economics textbook model. Very, very dangerous because it bears no relationship to how people make decisions or indeed how the labour market works. But there we go. So no, I don't have any difficulty. I would spend more money on information advice and guidance and actually cut back some spending on certain sorts of training through block.
Perhaps you should become Secretary of State after all. Okay. Okay, questions or comments? And could you indicate who you are, where you're from, please?
You're all horrified, aren't you?
Heather Jackson, I'm Chair of Mayage, she's the adult.
Actually, could you stand up here, would you mind? Or stand outside board?
I've got lots of things I could say. One in particular is about the MVQ level 2. I heard what she said, but I think it has to be said that for those young people in particular, or adults who are very low skill, there must be some intrinsic value in undergoing some kind of program that will improve their skills in some way, regardless of the labour market situation. There must be, you're implying an intrinsic value isn't enough. And I think there must be some intrinsic value in that kind of learning.
I think there probably is an intrinsic value, but don't forget that, in a sense, I suppose what I'm criticising the use of it as a huge blanket program like Train to Gain. It's interesting that the Train to Gain evaluations is very clear. The real bonus from Train to Gain was that it improved a lot of people's learning competence. But that was a big deal. It is a big deal. But I think I could have done it more cheaply in different ways. But what's really clear is that the long-term, what big econometric data we have from tax returns suggests that the wage premium that people believe that people are getting from Train to Gain doesn't exist. And that's a real problem. And I think, yes, there are plenty of people who are right at the bottom of the learning pile. We need to move them forward in easy steps. There's no two ways about that. We need to build their confidence. But having 3 Qs, which are the main learning entitlement and performance indicator for our education and training system, which are specified at levels far, far lower and far, far more narrowly than in most other European countries, does not seem to me to be a terribly helpful way to go. It's not to say that offering disadvantaged young people and adults learning opportunities and finding ways of progressing them so that they can move forward in relatively easy steps, highly important. But the way that we've done it through our use of VQs and specification of VQs, I think is problematic and has led to a vast waste of money and has actually given people things that have relatively labour market value, whatever their intrinsic learning value, they are not particularly great experiences. Because the other thing is that in finding the money to fund Trains to Gain, previous government raided the lifelong learning budget in ways that it will probably never ever recover from in my lifetime. Was that a good trade-off? Oh, good question.
Paul Vaquet.
Stand up forward and play, sorry.
all hacking freelance consultant. I enjoyed your storyboard perspective, particularly reference to iCeGS and the equality of iCeGS. I just wondered, looking back quite a while, and not the other people remember, when there were industrial training boards and there was a statutory obligation on the behalf of employers to participate in education and trade with the apprenticeships, whether that actually started the decline from them. Unless there is a statutory obligation, then you're wasting your time, really.
I think that certainly when the statutory IT, most of the statutory ITBs were wound up, the thinking on the part of the government at the time was that employers were just being constrained by this terrible bureaucracy, and once they were freed up, and once the economy had recovered, employers would really invest in the training that they needed, and everything would go forward from there. Well, in a sense, it did. Employers do invest in the training they need. No two ways about it. Most firms invest in the amount of training and the type of training for those employees that require it, that they need. The problem is that the level to which that takes place and the distribution across the working population are not the ones to which policymakers aspire. That's where the catch comes in.
Shifting that is going to be really, really difficult, and particularly within the voluntary system. I don't know what the answer is, except to try and move away from framing it as a training issue. It seems to me that endlessly exhorting employers to do more training is a waste of time. Employers are pretty resistant to that message, and part of it I don't really blame them. I'm not going to train more than I need to, unless I can see some kind of long-term business case to do it. It seems to me that through a business improvement policy, economic development policy, through various ways that one might regulate over time the labour market, you could begin to change employers' structural demand skills and therefore increase the amount of time, energy and money they invest in training. But until you go down that road, we really are going to struggle to get employers to do more than they currently feel inclined to do.
Does that include the notion of investing in the designer pathways? Does the same point apply?
It may very well do. I mean, it seems to me that one of the interesting issues when you look at what's happened with pathway design in other countries is that it has been relatively dependent upon employers collectively seeing it was a problem, feeling slightly responsible for dealing with it rather than just fobbing it off, and having employer bodies, usually at sectoral level, that are actually capable of progressing the issue. Now, there are plainly some of our sector skills councils that could progress that issue. And there are others where I think the question would be a very open one, whether they have the resources, the motivation, or the contact with their members to make any progress whatsoever. That's part of it.
And that's not, I was just a question I want to follow, but Deirdre, since you're a commissioner, you did mention the commission. And last year we had last year was on the Chief Executive of the Commission. And the Commission its policy is to have employer-led approaches for precisely these kinds of reasons. And I just wondered whether you might want to comment or ask a question or whatever in relation to this issue, because it seems to me the Commission is one of the vehicles which has been established and is now being managed to try to do this, but it's not easy. Do you want to say anything? Do you want to stand up with me?
Stands up. Thank you for that, Tony. Well, first of all, thank you. I'd be delighted to go back and report to Charlie Nayfield and all the other commissioners why you're finding the work valuable. And I suppose my question that was going on in my mind, and it was for you, Ewart, which was around, we've got a new minister now, a new skills minister, and very keen to make his mark. And in looking at this whole issue of credentialism, apprenticeships, traineeships, and employer ownership, and I think without doubt, from a Commission's point of view, and you'll see this next year, that the government's announced in England, particularly around the industrial strategy, that strong emphasis on employer engagement, employer stepping up to the challenge. Everyone had the youth policy. My question to you is around the traineeships, that are on the horizon, that came out of the Richard Review, which was
the simple message was to say that apprenticeships need to be proper apprenticeships in line to some extent with what we're seeing in other parts of Europe. And so in order to get us to that point, then we need traineeships. And just was wondering, listening to you, you know, Brandon, how are we going to get these messages out now to young people and parents and others? This is what an apprentice is, and this is what traineeship is, and you know the differences.
That's the problem. I mean, I think that in a sense we're going to now find that the consequences of a loose usage of the definition of apprenticeship in past years is going to come back to haunt us. It will haunt us also, I think, will employers. And I think a lot of employers have now, insofar they've got the vaguest of notions, particularly in the service sector, what apprenticeship is. It's just another government. It's another potential stream of government and sponsorship to help support some kind of trade, and that is not really be much more specific than that. If there's a huge if the Richard Review recommendations get implemented, I wouldn't bank my pension, didn't bet my pension on that one. It seems to me that yes, we are going to have a much narrower and probably rather more useful definition of apprenticeship. We are going to have to have things that are alongside that. There still will be, as there always have been, adult workers who need skills upgrade, accreditation of prior learning, whatever, but we won't be able to call that apprenticeship, and there probably won't be any government funding for it, because we'll have to build up themselves. And there will certainly be, for many young people who cannot directly access apprenticeship because they're not at the sufficient level to do so, are going to need help. All the more so because of the requirement that they've now got to do maths and English GCSE of some form. That is going to, or well, actually, won't be GCSE because GCSE is going to vanish. But that's going to be a big problem for many trained providers and for many employers. So I do think that yes, there will have to be some kind of pre-apprenticeship for quite a lot of young people who actually want to access apprenticeship and would benefit from. But I think there is a broader problem. The broader problem is one that I've realized more and more over time, because it's sort of built up in my head, is the way in which we fiddle with institutions, funding schemes, qualifications, and programs like apprenticeship. They change and get rebranded and recalibrated because every incoming minister, just like the new one, wants to make their mark, and their mark is to fiddle around with things. Now, it's great for them. It's pretty stupid from the point of view of people who actually have to run the education and training system and make it work. But from the point of view of young people and their parents, it renders the whole thing completely incomprehensible. And I don't know any other developed country that does this to the same extent as we do. In fact, there was an OECD League test. This girl with Norwich, his sister, I could guarantee that we would be top of it every single year.
But it's always the vocational side which has to be changed, not the academic side.
Well, except you will, once you
Just 1, 2, 3.
There's a. I mean, as you're talking, I've said that we've got the idea that we've got apprenticeship, which we need to kind of ramp up and make it into a more substantial thing. And then we've got a whole group of people who perhaps aren't ready for that, or, as you say, the work that they're doing does not necessarily require that level of education. And what I've heard people like Alison Walk say is, well, aren't we keeping people in education too long? Aren't we keeping people in education when there isn't really a need for it? And wouldn't it be better, you kind of touched on it, wouldn't it be better to try and calibrate the employer's expectations a bit more and to provide a kind of, basically to reinvigorate a straight from school youth labour market where their employers recognise they're going to recruit people for low skill jobs and provide them with the kind of minimum training then required for that job, and then they do the job. Now there's an attraction to that, but my concern with it would be the one you just made, which is where then is the progression, which
it's very attractive from point of view of employers, but it's not attractive from the point of view of society and young people. No, I mean, and actually as they get older, we're still going to be stuck in these jobs, so a lot will be money. I think that one way I think is it. Given that basically you have a choice, it seems to me. Well, three choices as far as I like to see. One is that you carry on privileges among them, and that you basically provide training that you aim to provide training that is broader and deeper than what employers currently need for young people in some sectors and occupations, but you hope that enough of that learning is transferable or it allows them to re-access learning further down the road, which is what many European countries do. But that would require substantial changes in the way that we organise things. Obviously, we could just carry on as we do. Second one is Alison's idea, which I think you sort of summed up very neatly. Fewer people go through and more people enter the labour market, and we just stop. It's nonsense, as she would think of it, of everyone participating from 60, 90. And in a sense, that it is a bit of a nonsense because it doesn't match up with what the labour market really requires. But a third way to go, if we're not willing to regulate the labour market, if we're not willing to try and push employers very hard, would be to say, well, we've got voluntary raising and lowering age, whatever that means, because as it's voluntary, it doesn't seem to be there is a raising and lowering age in any shape or form, but no matter. But that we actually start to think about rebalancing our resources and that we basically try to provide more second chance opportunities for people. So yes, they do enter crap jobs, and whatever we do with the additional training system, they're going to land up in crap jobs. But what we have to try to do is give those who've got the ability or the get up and go or the opportunity to actually return to learning and do something different and retrain or move on and move up and move out. That would be the kind of thing, just supposed in the way the nice inquiry into like Bangladesh suggested, to rebalance the learning funds so that we give people a lifelong learning account. We don't front load the vast bulk of spending onto young people. Now that's just revolution talk.
I mean, can I come back? Because I think, to me, one of the key, if you imagine that situation where a number of people finish school, they go into work, and they take up work without qualifications, then that re-engaging them in the learning system is going to be very challenging. And to me, one of the elements that needs to be there, as well as adequately funded adult education, which we're a long way away from at the moment. But one of the other ones is advice and guidance or careers intervention that can work into the workplace, which is currently not there at all. I mean, it would be. I mean, there are models, so we think of, but essentially it would be about inventing a way that something like the National Careers Service could work into employers and engage with low-skilled workers and re-engage them then in a renewed. As you say, it's quite a big shift, isn't it? But it seems right to me. But I mean, it is a big ask.
Uni and Learn would argue that some of that they're very good. Yeah, they're at the upper end of the scale. That's what some of their good uni and learning reps are actually doing, and I think that's probably true. Problem is that the vast private sector workplaces are no longer unionised, so it doesn't get to them. But I do think that there is a real issue about we are continued to obsess about initial education and training, and we have tended to neglect second chance learning, adult development. And when we have tried to do it, we haven't, and particularly in training to gain, we haven't done it terribly well.